Good morning. Welcome to this second panel of this second edition of the EU-LAC Economic Forum. We'll face now sectoral opportunities of EU-LAC relations, telecom infrastructures, connectivity, and the effect of digitalization on the bilateral or bi-regional relations. We have an excellent panel, but we have, for the moment, a lack. We have with us Juan Yung, Director of Public Policy of the Inter-American Association of Telecommunications Companies, and also Scott Marcus, Senior Fellow from Bruegel. We face the consequences of the digital revolution that has deep effects on social, economic, and political dimensions. As Mr. Trump said frequently in his tweets, the consequences of the digital revolutions are tremendous, but the implementation of social media by Mr. Trump allow us to enter in this. Welcome, Mr. Fabio Nazarre de Letosa. The three of us. As I said, the implementation of Mr. Trump of social media allow us to go into directly of the consequences of this digital revolution, the technological changes that affects both sides of the bi-regional relationships. The question is, how? The question is, how big is the digital gap between our two regions? The question is, what are the necessities of infrastructures in both sides of the Atlantic Ocean? The question is, how possible and effective will be the cooperation between the two regions? And how are the opportunities to European companies in Latin America, but also to Latin American companies in Europe? We saw in the last years a very important increase of Latin American investments in Europe, specifically in Spain. So we will begin with the intervention of Juan Yung, secondly Scott Marcus, and finally Fabio Nazarre. Please, Juan.
Thank you, Carlos, and many thanks to the organizers for inviting us yet to be part of this important seminar and to discuss these important topics. Latin America and Europe both share the same conviction that digitalization is key for their future progress. In the case of Latin America, this is the world's region that has registered the lowest productivity growth rates in the past 20 years. Productivity is a serious problem for Latin America. The GDP has grown, mainly driven by the commodity prices and the exportations, the demand of natural resources. But now that the commodity super cycle has ended, the lack of productivity growth arises again, and it is urgent for the region to afford to face that challenge. A recent study by McKinsey suggested that if Latin America is not able to to do a jump in its productivity levels, the GDP growth for the next 15 years would be the half of the previous 15 years. And they linked that productivity growth to digitalization. So digitalization is key. In the case of Europe, of course, Europe is much more advanced than Latin America in GDP per capita and in productivity levels, but they are still facing some challenges, not only because of the crisis that happened here from 2008 and the following years, that is still affecting some countries, but also because both Europe and Latin America share a common fact, that they are both lying behind the United States in terms of the dynamism of the digital economy. And that is something that both regions have in common. Despite the gap between both regions in digitalization, they both have in common that fact that they are lying behind the US. And I'm going to give you some numbers about that. If you see the percentage of local content that the people access through internet, you will see that in North America, 60% of the contents accessed in internet by the North Americans is from local content, is content from North America. In the case of Western Europe, that percentage is only 36%. So 65% is for content from outside Europe. In the case of Latin America, it's still worse, 26%. Nearly 3 every 4 websites that Latin America visits are not related to Latin American content. And who is the winner in all this? The United States. So both Latin America and Europe are exporting profits to the United States in terms of the digital ecosystem. I can give you more numbers. If you see the market share of browsers, you can see that Google Chrome has 77% of the market share in Latin America. In Europe, 52%. If you see the market share of the search engines, Google has 97% of the market share in Latin America, and in Europe, 92%. If you see the market share of social networks, Facebook has 87% in Latin America and 84% in Europe. So there is a US dominance in terms of the digital dynamism that we can figure that with these numbers. And as a result, both Latin America and Europe share a common objective, that is how they can work together to overcome this, to develop their own digital ecosystem, to develop their own contents, applications, systems, and also the introduction of digitalization in the industrial processes. So cooperation is key between Europe and Latin America. Very important to find synergies between both regions because they are natural allies. We have talked before about the common values, the common democracies, values of democracy, cultural. So these are this is a natural alliance, and also they can work together to act as a counterweight to the US in the world map. This can be a strategic alliance. Especially now that under Mr. Trump leadership, the United States has entered in an isolation phase of its world leadership in the international scene. So the traditional transatlantic relations between Europe and the US, it is now losing strength, as well as the relationship between US and Latin America. How the region can cooperate, how both regions can cooperate? Well, in the first place, cooperation can take place through the exchange of sound regulatory practices, fiscal practices, and institutional practices to promote the innovation and the development of the digital ecosystem. Both regions can benefit from these interactions. Another second important point is that of the creation of a digital single market, that Europe is making big advances in this topic. And in Latin America, even if not a counterpart institution like the European Commission, so it's very difficult to promote this in Latin America. In any case, the digital single market is a topic on the agenda. It has been discussed in several congresses, and it's a topic for the authorities. It is taking place also in ECLAC from the United States as a working group. So the topic is still there, and Europe can help providing political and technical support to Latin America in terms of policies aimed to integrate its digital markets. It is true that Latin America does not have a supranational institution like the European Commission, but we have some very important competitive advantages to integrate our markets. For instance, we have a common culture and in almost all countries a common language. So for developing local content and for developing application systems, software, and so on, we can have a potential market of 600 million people. So we must sure take a look to that opportunity. Other important factors that can constitute cooperation between both regions is that of how to face that situation of the increasing oligopoly situation from US platforms in this region, and also taxation. There is some tax engineering practices by some companies that to avoid paying taxes, and this is creating a serious problem to the treasury of most European countries and Latin America countries. To develop strategies to overcome that is another opportunity. I can go further with these concepts in a second intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Scott.
Well, thank you very much. I think that tees up the issues very nicely. I'll just add one statistic to the ones that you were tossing out, if I might, and that is as far as the dominance of U.S. content. Even though European producers create about 2.5 times as many feature films as Hollywood in any given year, cinema receipts in European box offices are in any given year about 2/3 for American production and only about 1/4 for European. And this clearly has nothing to do with the quality of the films. It does have something to do perhaps with the lack of international marketing plans on the part of those who create the media productions. But again, the dominance is a real issue. The taxation is a real issue. I think you put this in a very nice frame. What I was looking to do was actually to dig a little deeper into one of the specific issues for the panel, and that's the infrastructure issue. Breaking a bit with the format of the day, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I thought I'd put up a few pictures. Could the gang? Thank you very much. Okay, so here what I was looking to touch on is the infrastructure needs for the region. Clearly, to use digital content, you have to be able to get to it, and Latin America has deficits. There are other deficits that I won't touch on in these remarks. Anything from training to entrepreneurship, skills, all of these are relevant. But if we simply look at the infrastructure for broadband, there's some pretty clear deficits there. And this infrastructure issue, I think, was also prominently featured in the remarks of Mr. Fernandez de Soto. So if we look at some of the statistics, these are OECD statistics on fixed broadband connections. It's subscriptions per 100 inhabitants, and the countries in the region that are OECD members, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, all are within the red circle. So on fixed penetration, they're at the low end. Now, there are two cautions about this. The first one is a subscription for a fixed network typically serves the family, not the individual. So multiply that by the average number of individuals in Latin America, and the figures are maybe not so depressing. But the other is, in Europe, we tend to focus very much on fixed penetration. Outside of Europe and the US, the real network is the mobile network. And there the picture is a bit more optimistic. Again, the Latin American members of OECD tend to be at the lower end, but not so solely at the lower end. Chile in particular is a bit higher up on the rankings. Germany is not so great either, honestly, yes. Yes, Germany actually has, Germany has a lot of rural areas. People don't realize that, and the penetration in those areas is not so great. Also, in Europe, we have typical underinvestment in the areas that were historically behind the Iron Curtain. So in the East, we have underinvestment, indeed. Okay, so, you know, here you've got data, slightly old data. This is from an OECD IDB report. So these are actually 2014 data in a 2016 report. The dots toward the top are mobile penetration, and the bars at the bottom are mobile broadband penetration. And here you've got pretty much all of the countries in the region. Again, it's a useful counterpoint to the other because here you've got a much larger sample of Latin American countries. And what we see is there's some that are reasonably okay relative to the dark bar, which is the OECD, OECD average. Overall, you've got a mix. A lot of countries are still toward the lower end. Now, the mobile penetration you have to look at with a little care. When you see these 100% and more penetration numbers, that doesn't really mean that everybody has a mobile phone. A lot of people have two or more. In many cases, that has more to do with regulatory defects than it does with positive penetration. The real question is, who doesn't have access? That's the big deal. And the GSMA has estimated that even in 2020, about 250 million people in Latin America won't have digital access. That's the key number. That's the gap to close. And for that, there's clearly work to be done. And what kind of work has to be done? Well, I've done a little work in Latin America. Some of it was for the Peruvian regulator, Oacd. And there, getting bandwidth to the people is a very different proposition in coastal cities with money, like Lima, than it is when you talk about getting bandwidth to people in the Andes or in the jungles beyond. So for that reason, there is work to be done. This is a map showing undersea cables, which is the main way that the bandwidth is delivered really throughout the world. And what we see here, there's a lot more cables than there were. Historically, the Caribbean had been largely dominated by one company in the past. These days, you've got a proliferation of cables, and they reach many of the main coastal cities in Latin America. Getting into the interior is always where the problem is likely to be. Latin America has the advantage that you've got really only two main landlocked countries, Bolivia and Paraguay. But still, there's a lot of territory there that's not sitting squarely on the coast and that needs to be served. So there's work to be done. I will say Latin America has done a number of interesting innovations. How effective they've been remains to be seen, or there's mixed results with a number of them. One was the reversed auctions that were pioneered by Bjorn Wallenius and his colleagues at the World Bank years back. Again, it hasn't worked perfectly. Another one where the jury is still out is a mobile wholesale-only network that Mexico has implemented in the 700 megahertz band, prime spectrum. Some questions about how well that will work. It's taken an awfully long time to get it up. Press reports say that it seems to be up. I'm not sure if it's actually got customers on it. Juan may know the status better than I do. But really, how well that will work in practice and whether it has any negative effects, for example, crowding out competition, remain to be seen. So there's work to be done, and I would argue Europe is, I would argue, in most respects, an example of regulatory best practice, but not all of European practice can be ported one for one into the region, and one has to take into account the very different market circumstances and other factors. And with that, that's my opening remarks. Back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Scott. Fabio.
I have a certain Back to the Future feeling because I was really heavily involved 15 years ago and the conception of a lot of the pillars of the cooperation between Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean. I was there when we launched the first dialogue on digital agendas through the ALICE programs. I saw the beginning of Regulatel, which is now an autonomous, self-sustained entity. And when I look at things, now in the meantime I move on, I did more with internal matters having to do with investment in higher speed broadband, etc. But when I go back after all these years, I can draw a few quick conclusions. One of them is that we didn't get it that wrong in terms of identifying the pillars of what a dialogue with Latin America and the Caribbean could be. And the other is that we have succeeded to put digital very high in the political agenda. 15 years ago, we were more often seen as techies, sectoral people. I think that now, because of things that have to do with what Juan said about the role of digital in competitiveness, in social also cohesion, you don't have to start by really making a big claim about what is your added value, what is your role around the table. So I see really digital really playing a increasingly important role in the bi-regional cooperation, as it does already in a number of bilateral cooperations. Now, we are at an interesting moment of our relationship. We have continued growing around a number of areas. In terms of policy, the European Union is now in full implementation of its digital single market proposals. I think that we have worked out a reasonable way of engaging with Latin America and the Caribbean. Juan mentioned that, of course, I mean, a certain handicap may be the lack of the same institutional frame. For us, we adopt certain proposals. We have an agenda, digital single market instrument, and we have really the possibility to go into regulatory proposals, etc. Well, thanks to the cooperation with ECLAC and the different dialogues all over these years, I think that building on this community of interest, language, culture in Latin America, and I think the mutual interest in really seeing each other as really viable models, we have managed really to go a long way. Latin America is maturing its project with a EU-LAC strategy, and I think that our engagement is to continue the dialogue because it's a true partnership between our experiences around DSM and the EU-LAC process. We have now launched a project that looks at what are the new ideas, the new topics around which this cooperation could be built. The processes, the frames may stay, but the world changes and there are new topics, new ideas. We are very open. We had a conference in July with many stakeholders. I think that for us it is important before we embark in the next process of multi-annual cooperation with Latin America to understand what are the priority topics where there is a common interest to really build a better understanding and deepen these exchanges. I think that the continuation of the cooperation around regulatory issues will continue. We did it in a more telco-oriented manner in the past through the cooperation between Regulatel, 15 years already working, really bringing together all Latin American regulators, and BEREC, the Association of National Regulatory Authorities in Europe. But now there are also other issues around the table. We have 5G, we have the Internet of Things, we have artificial intelligence, we have data flows. So we need to think a bit also how we move in these regulatory exchanges. Juan and Scott Marcus mentioned also the role of e-commerce and platforms. there is thinking, there is work in Europe. I think that there is a common interest also in Latin America to have a reflection about the many aspects which are a link to this issue of e-commerce and the role of platforms. There are common threats and issues of interest like cybersecurity. I'm glad also to have heard about issues that have to do with media and audiovisual industry. I could add copyrights to that. And we have also common endeavors, for instance, to build a multi-stakeholder governance framework for the internet. And continue in other areas. So it's important for us really to understand, to identify where these common interests lay, so that we can build over the next years to come really with the support of the European Commission, a continued dialogue which builds on what we have achieved in the past, but opens to these new topics. Next to that, I would not want to close these initial remarks without recalling also that we have a very rich cooperation in the research field. FP7 closed with more than 140 projects where we had Latin American participation with European funding. With some countries, we have been able to move into a more mature way of research cooperation, organizing coordinated calls, where EU participants are financed from the EU budget, but the calls are aligned with calls in Latin American countries, so that also Latin American participants receiving funding from Latin American budgets can participate in these joint or coordinated calls. We have an interesting project to reinforce the transatlantic cable links between Latin America and Europe, with a forthcoming cable between Fortaleza and the European continent, which has also extensions to really link two different countries in Latin America, with the idea to continue contributing to this research cooperation, but also making accessible facilities and capabilities in Latin America to European partners and researchers, and vice versa, access by Latin American partners to European research facilities and encourage data flows. So it's a richer legacy. I think it's the right setting in the terms of the multitude of instruments we use. But I look forward to the dialogue today and with all of you to see a bit what we take next over the coming years, this cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we have a second round. You have 3 minutes each to make more comments or remarks. Juan.
Thank you. I wanted to go a little bit deeper in some of the topics raised by Scott. Latin America has the biggest and most urgent challenge that Latin America has is that of closing the digital divide. That is a key topic for Latin America, and that should be in a top place of the agenda, of the public policy agenda in the next few years. And this is a difference we have with Europe, that it is at more advanced stages, as Scott showed in his charts. Latin America has been making very important advances in terms of penetration. Mobile penetration it is beyond 100%. Quality has been improved. Prices have been going down. But still, there is nearly a half of Latin Americans that do not use internet, that are usually the half most poor of the region. We produced a study some years ago to find out how much investment was needed in order to close that digital divide. We found a figure of $400 million over a period of 8 years. But more important than that was a figure that it was 10% higher to what the tendency would suggest, the trend would suggest, if we continue like we are. So it is a very important effort that necessarily requires of public policies promoting and providing the incentives to invest. And we are in a complex scenario to produce those investments because prices have been reducing. The ARPU, that is the revenue that the telecom operators get from every user on average, in Latin America is about $9 per month. Do you know how much is that in Europe? Over 30. You know how much it is in the US? 50. In Latin America, we have $9 per user every month. In Africa, it is 7. So we are closer to Africa than to Europe in that sense. So we need very important regulatory reforms to eliminate asymmetries that we have in the framework, especially with some internet services that are competing for the same market segments as the telecom operators. And we need, of course, long-term view, public-private dialogue and cooperation, certainty, initiatives for cost reduction in terms of harmonization of local versus national norms. We need reasonable spectrum prices. We need agility in license processes and so on. And we need to apply same service, same rules as a philosophy in the digital ecosystem in order to have a wealthy competition within the digital ecosystem. Taxation is a very important issue. Taxation should be low. In Latin America, the telecommunications sector has a taxation level over 50% over the average of all the other industries. So if you think that this is a sector in which our future lies here and we must massify this for everyone, you should give a fiscal treatment different like what it is happening now. And also, as I said before, the people that is unconnected is the poorer people. We need commercial flexibility to design commercial offers to all the segments of the population, and we need also help from the governments in terms of subsidies or lowering taxes for those specific population segments. This is the main challenge. Then we can go in a further intervention with other topics.
Well, I think an awful lot of it has just been said. I'd like to come back to this question of the degree to which regional institutions are needed. I think there's some things that can be done through exchange of regulatory best practice among the regulators themselves, through Oacd, through Regulatel, through other bodies. There's some other things that actually are quite hard. One of the ones that I have some experience with is international mobile roaming. There, for example, we have the European Union that has something in place here. I actually led the work done in the 6 countries in the GCC, the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar. There's also a system in place, but again, it was something that you had an institutional framework where it could be put in place. The ministers actually voted on some recommendations I made, and it was there. Trying to do that without either a comprehensive free trade agreement or else that kind of institutional framework would run one into WTO issues. So, in fact, some things actually would benefit from an institutional framework, and I think there we have a challenge. Okay, with that, back to the chair and over to Fabio, I guess.
Yeah. There are many fronts and many ways of tackling this challenge of the digital divide, lack of connectivity or take-up. We are not immune in Europe. We had this week a hearing at the Parliament with the Court of Auditors that have been looking at European policies, and they say, well, the rural divide is still a big issue also in Europe. First, in Europe, we are trying to use policy instruments. And the first thing we've done is really to come with ambitious goals. I mean, you have to motivate, you must have really a constant tension with preparation of national broadband plans, where really a comprehensive look at all the different ways of tackling the issue is put together, and always with a forward-looking vision. We had objectives for 2013 and 2020 in the digital agenda for Europe. We have now a new communication with looks at 2025, and it starts looking at things like 5G really and further fiber deepening. We are also playing on regulation. We have just recently have a political agreement between the co-legislators, the Council and the Parliament, on a new electronic communications code for Europe. And we have managed to give one further step in really ensuring that we are facilitating that a spectrum rightly coordinated is available for next 5G and for other ways of really bringing wireless communications and wireless broadband. We have interesting initiatives in the code about how to foster co-investment also in more rural, in more difficult areas, wholesale models, the role of mapping. We're doing a lot of work in Europe now to see how different national authorities and regulators are mapping networks and service. I mean, because knowledge is the base of any further action. We are also working on the financial side. There is one part which is perhaps less interesting for a discussion today, because there are instruments which are just European instruments, but there has been a whole debate about the role of financial instruments and whether there is a category of projects that we could take out from those type of projects that will normally require heavy subsidies, but with some support to reduce the risk of the project from public budgets. We could still turn into projects that can attract private investors. And then let's not forget, I mean, take up anything you do for public services, for digitization of industry, to ensure that the skills, the more sophisticated and the more basic are there. It is essential. I think that this gives a rich basis for discussion. We are trying to encourage this discussion among really the national authorities in charge of the implementation of broadband plans. We have a broadband competence center that brings at national, regional level all the authorities interested across the EU in working on these strategies. And this gives us further thoughts also about how we can engage also with partner countries and the Latin American Caribbean region. Thanks.
Okay, we have time to some questions, remarks. Angel?
Okay, thank you for a great panel. I've enjoyed it a lot, but I would like to make three points, not out from the discussion, but just to reinforce some of the things that have been said. The first thing is about access in the region, and in fact, I think Jay Scott has remarked it at the end of his presentation, that one of the most important difficulties for the region is now the lack of interconnection through submarine cables. The last report from FCC, from the Federal Communications Commission in the US, shows that the connection of the US to the world through bandwidth, through submarine cables, is 27% of bandwidth to Asia, 57% to Europe, and 16% to Latin America. And as we know, all Latin American traffic goes through this 16%, because all Latin American traffic needs to cross this bottleneck of the Miami transactors. So even if the LA-Link, the project created by certain after the revelations of all the case of the NSA, of the decision of the Brazilian government not to go through the US for its communications, will change a little bit the situation up from 2020. The project Telelink of Telebras. Second thing is an important issue too that I don't remember to have heard to be mentioned. That is the change of actor in the field. The GAFAM, the Google, Facebook, Apple, are starting to implement infrastructure of connection. And this is happening in the last 2 or 3 years. And it's extremely important to understand that there's not only a question of telecom companies, but also of traditional service companies that are now putting into action interconnection submarine cables. The best example of that is the Maria cable, which is being implemented these days and which will connect directly North America and Bilbao and Spain and the European Union. So the question is, what are we going to do from Europe? Because as Juan has pointed out, the whole actors in this field are from North America. So these actors, which are now providing for cluster services, for financial services, etc., are based in this, we called it in an Elcano paper, the new Fertile Crescent, because it's something from the Japan to the west coast of North America. Everything comes from that, from hardware to software to services. But now these companies is also providing for interconnection. This is, I think, an important challenge for all of us. And third, a very, very small question, but I'd like to mention it. The necessity of spectrum of telecom operators in Latin America to expand access is at the same time rearranging frequencies used cheaply by radio and television for free access of all the population, and radio and television, free on the air radio and television is very important in Latin America, and these frequencies are needed to expand the coverage of 4G, 5G services in Latin America. So this puts in danger also some of small actors of traditional broadcasting in Latin America, which are very important for public opinion and for democracies in most countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ángel. Ambassador.
Thank you. Miguel Vesbolowskis, Ambassador of Panama. I'd like to also thank the panelists for making a very interesting presentation. Undeniable case, I would say, for the problem that this digital gap poses and also the opportunity that it provides. But I just have one question, probably more for Mr. Jung and Mr. Marcus. I don't see why it's necessarily a problem that half or more of the internet, the information consumed through the internet is generated outside of both regions. I mean, if anything, it seems to make us, I would think, more cosmopolitan and than our U.S. counterparts, and therefore less susceptible or more or less prone to isolationism in information. Thank you.
Susana Legra from Cuban Embassy. Thanks for inviting us to this event. I want also to apologize my ambassador that in the last moment it was impossible for her to come here. Really, I am not a specialist in technologies, but I only has been listening all the debate and everything you have been speaking about. And it is very interesting, for my country it is very interesting what you are saying, and also I think for the region, because technologies are now decides the development. I can say that because technologies are everywhere. And we think that we together can do a lot of things to develop our interchange, our cooperation, go ahead, taking into consideration that really for us it is important to look for another way other than the United States, and you know very well why it is our position. And we, with very, very difficult situation, have been developing these technologies in our countries, in our country. But you have been saying that we do not have in the region a structure to make this cooperation. And it have came to my mind that in the region we do have a structure to make the coordination and to develop the cooperation. And we have example that we can do things very important with the organization we have in the region. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately because Cuba has been take out of the organization that in which our countries in Latin America have been included, all of them. We have now CELAC, which is for us very important because it is the first time we have not been out of an organization in which all Latin American and Caribbean countries have been included. And for us, it is very important. And in CELAC, we have also an action plan. And I will give you an example. I think that in this action plan, we have a cooperation in research, which is led by DG INNO, and which it is functioning. I think that there are programs that are functioning there. They are doing something, for example, in the health system, and we think that we can take the good examples to make it in the practices. And I think that if we do something, if we organize everything, we can work together in sectors, sector by sector, and cooperate together, because we can have differences, but we are unified. And we have something that is very interesting. We have the desire to develop, and it is very important for both sides. And we can use this, I think that we can use this platform to make something for inclusive for all our countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, very quick. There were a lot of questions. I will go very quick. First, Ángel, of course, international connectivity in Latin America. Most traffic goes to Miami. That's a fact. A very important thing here is try to integrate better the networks within Latin America. For instance, AT&T was able to integrate its networks from Mexico to the US. If that exercise can be done between Latin America countries, would be very, very important, and that's probably a way forward. Also, to develop more IXPs, Internet Exchange Traffic Points within the region to avoid going to Miami. Public policies can have a lot to do there. Second, I know that there is not only telecom operators. In fact, the digital ecosystem is a much more wider and complex situation. You have an internet value chain in which transport is only one chain of that very important line, and you have a multiple type of companies. For that reason, we believe that regulation must contemplate the whole digital ecosystem and not only the one specific chain. Third, spectrum. I guess you were talking about the 700 band when you talk about the TV. Well, most TV frequencies are migrating to the digital TV, and that 700 band has been identified as the most useful because of the propagation characteristics of the band in order to close the digital divide. There is a study from Plum Consulting that analyzed the economic impact of using the 700 band for mobile and also for alternative different uses. One was TV and other ones, defense, aviation, whatever, and the biggest economic impact for the society was found in the case of the mobile. Then, to the question, I'm going very quick. The question about the oligopolies of the US that Miguel was saying. Here we have two main topics. One, a loss of opportunity for European or Latin America startups and companies in order to show their creation and to give a value added and to generate wealth within the region for the region. And the second one are the risk for the market and for the consumers. These oligopoly situations can make some intermediaries to take advantage of the vertical integration, to collect valuable information from the users, and to act in a discriminatory manner. And this is reinforced if we take into account that they are located abroad and it is difficult for regulations to apply for them. So this can be harmful for the market, for the consumers, and also for a European or a Latin America software or application or intermediary that has to pay taxes, has to face regulation, and has very difficult to compete in this situation. And finally, the question about international organizations. It is true, it is a LAC. We have a CLAC that has been working in a digital agenda. We have a lot of spaces in Latin America to discuss, to share best practices, to take conscience of all these important topics, but there is something that is lacking. Those institutions are not binding, as in the case of the European Commission, and that is a difficulty. At the end of the day, each country in Latin America can go with their own agenda and do what they want, because this exchange of best practices is not always binding. Thank you.
Well, as usual, Juan has cleared a lot of the balls off of the pool table, not leaving too many for me. You do a good job. No, that's quite all right. But let me come back actually to the points nonetheless. First off, on the question about the undersea cables, I think, again, clearly the cables go where they go. The traffic went through the United States largely for historical reasons and will continue probably largely to go there because so much of the content is there. It's the natural way to route them. But there's still quite a bit that can be done. A 2017 GSMA report made comments a bit further than what Juan did about how a lot of the LACs additionally related to lack of national backbones, lack of regional backbones, and also lack of national IXPs, Internet Interconnection Points. So again, there's certainly things that can be done. As far as, let's see, the point on spectrum, again, it's true that most studies suggest that the values are greater for mobile services than for telecoms, than for television, over-the-air television. And of course, in some countries, also in some Latin American countries, a significant amount of the television is delivered over cable systems, at least in the metropolitan areas. Indeed, the way it's largely been addressed in the 700, also the 800 bands in Europe, has been with migration to more modern technology, which meant that the stations in most cases were actually able to send more channels over the remaining spectrum. And that's also the reason why not all of the spectrum down to the low end of the video band has been transferred to mobile. I think it still leaves the question, what do people do? And of course, we have this issue very much in Europe as well. In the northern parts of Europe, an awful lot of broadcast television has instead migrated to either cable or satellite. In the south, free-to-air television continues to be very much a factor, and so indeed the migration of these broadcast facilities was pretty critical. One possibility I'd toss out for funding that's been used in other contexts, some countries, including France and the United States, when they free military spectrum for mobile use, will on occasion take part of the reserve price from the auction and set that aside to compensate incumbents for the cost of vacating the incumbent spectrum. So in other words, let's say the broadcasters could get some money out of the auction to help them to make the conversion to the newer technology. I think this is, for the military, sensible because it tends to speed up the migration out of the spectrum, right? It means that they get compensated, and it also might be tied to deadlines. Most people think of the auction as a way for governments to make money. That's not why the auction is there. The auction is there to make sure that the spectrum gets assigned to parties that value it most and therefore will use it best. And that also, by the way, is more or less the proof, even more so than the Plum study, as to why the mobile users probably value the spectrum more they can do more with it, they can get more value out of it. So that I agree with. Let's see, on the question about does it really hurt that we have so much of the content provided from the United States? I'm actually all for media pluralism. I think it's good that not all European content comes from European providers. I don't see why it has to be at the ratios that it currently is, and I don't see why it all has to come from one country. Also, I'd be much happier if the European industry were better able to produce things for a global market. Again, it turns out only about 18% of European audiovisual production is done with a multicultural, multilingual group in mind. It's the marketing plans on the part of those who create the media that are fouled up. And this needs to be fixed, and it's not a geo-blocking problem, it's a fundamental problem with industry structure in Europe. As far as the question about international cooperation, in fact, there are a lot of different things that are done in the digital single market, and some are more amenable to cooperative measures than others. It depends actually on how much the particular measure needs everything to be consistent. We have seen a tendency in Europe over the last decades to try to make things more consistent, and much of the reason is for companies that are doing electronic business, electronic commerce, this is your question, so in trying to promote cross-border electronic commerce, trying to make things more consistent is better for the merchants. It means they don't have to deal with so much national variation. So you see that in a lot of the measures that were done in the digital single market. One was done to try to make value-added tax more coherent, even though the rates are still different from country to country. Another, consumer protection. We have European consumer protection rules. In many cases, the member states went beyond them. This meant, once again, that the merchants had to be very much aware of circumstances in each member state. So the movement has been to make the harmonization tighter, actually to leave less room for the member states to innovate in ways that would make it harder for the merchants. And you see this in privacy, you see it in other areas too. So there's a lot that can be done with voluntary cooperation, but there are also limits. I think you have to look at the measures one by one to see how do you break down barriers to trade within the region and then in a second phase between regions, because I think what we've already clearly identified in the first panel is that there are pretty enormous opportunities to expand trade between Europe and the Latin American and Caribbean region. Thank you.
I think the advantage of being the last one is that I can be much more brief. A lot having said, I think I'm not going to reopen the debate on the spectrum issues. A lot could be done about the role of coverage obligations, for instance, to really foster coverage in the context of spectrums, digitization, etc. Just perhaps two remarks. One, just to say that I think that me personally, but also the Commission, we are in a more mood. I think what doesn't allow us to sleep is not whether there should be less foreign content or less US content. I mean, it's what really worries us is how to make sure that we have more of everything, that we have more European content in Latin America, more European content in the world, more Latin American content in Europe, more Latin American content and services everywhere. And this is a bit the dynamic that should really motivate us. I just want to perhaps renewing with the debate about cables and connectivity that Angel launched, just to introduce a new idea for thought. We have just presented the proposals for the next multi-annual financial perspectives. The new regional funds are out there. And one thing that these regional instruments look at with great attention is the situation of European outermost regions. Normally when you think about Europe, you think about continental Europe. You think it starts in Portugal, Spain, and very quickly moves to the center of Europe. But Europe is very close to Latin America. We are almost at your doors. There are a lot of these outermost regions there. And what these instruments are doing is bringing also more flexibility and possibilities for these outermost regions to cooperate more closely with its neighbors. We just talk, for instance, in terms of submarine cables about BEIA and how the Commission had become an anchor tenant to foster this public-private partnership. But in some of the structural funds, you will find, for instance, that some of our member states have considered the possibility of linking some of their outmost regions to this BELA cable, or to improve their connectivity also using regional funds. And the new instruments, which will now be discussed by the Parliament and Council, will facilitate that these outermost regions really engage in closer cooperation with the older neighbors. And I hope that digital will be one of those areas too. So just to close, to say that for us, I mean, the willingness to continue is clear. We want to build a consensus on how we move forward in cooperation with Latin America, and the real challenge is to come on a relatively limited number of topics with a clear action plan, something concrete, tangible, on which we can meet together in a few years' time and really assess whether we have delivered or we haven't delivered. But thank you very much for all the ideas that have been floating around and which are great input for us.
Thank you, Fabio. Speaking about the digital revolution, we have that, on the one hand, the digital revolution is a global challenge, but also the build-up of infrastructures, specifically telecom infrastructures, are regional challenge. But on the other hand, the response of governments, public policies, are national ones. Due to the fragmentation of the region, of Latin American fragmentation that Guillermo Fernández de Soto spoke in the introductory session, we have a very big gap there. How tackle global challenges with only political policies? If we don't succeed to go forward, the impact of global challenges will be more an obstacle than an opportunity. And that's, I suppose, important. We have time to only more questions. Guillermo.
Thank you. No, I agree completely what Carlos mentioned. We are promoting different spaces to try to improve the regional dialogue regarding this issue. Specifically in digital agenda, we are working with some other institutions to present to the Ibero-American Summit an agenda and a proposal for a digital agenda for Latin America. It has been work that we have been doing the last year, and we hope that it will help to have clear ideas regarding this issue. And second, we are going to have in July in Madrid an international conference with 15 ministers of Latin America regarding infrastructure. It's in the framework of our directory in Madrid. It's the first time that our bank, in which Spain and Portugal are members, have a directory outside Latin America. And in that framework, as you know, our core business is infrastructure. Then we are going to present our last report and our last plan approved by our directory regarding infrastructure, specifically to what we call logistic corridors for intelligent integration. It's very sophisticated. It is not just a matter of public constructions, highways, no. It's strategic that includes corredores logísticos for what you mentioned, Scott, and telecommunications. And if you want, you can assist because almost all the ministers will present the plans that they have in his particular country regarding infrastructure. Then it's a good opportunity. The only problem is that it's the 16th of July, is the day after. Maybe Belgium could win the World Cup. Then it will be party, or maybe Spain, I don't know. If it's in Spain, for us will be a terrible situation because no one is going to go to our conference. And seriously, it's going to be a very good opportunity. And if you want, you can be invited. Just mention to me. And
30 seconds.
Just a quick word, because I saw on the program that you had invited our former Minister for Communications. And I'll say not what he would have said, but I'll make just a quick comment on a very important project he led, which I think gives a different take on what you've been saying today, which is all about the gap. But I think that the most serious problem we have in our continent, and my friend Guillermo may not agree, is the problem of uneven development within our own countries and very, very serious territorial differences. And on that issue, the impact of connectivity has been huge. So our former Minister of Communications led a project where we established over 5,000 internet kiosks in the most remote areas of Colombia. Where, I mean, I remember being to some of those where if you took a car, it would take you 6 hours to get to the next town. And this has been a massive revolution. So I would encourage you also not to just think in great macro terms about how to connect the continent with the internet and the gap, that's all true, but also how to use this and mobilize these resources for integration of our own countries, which in this day and age where everything is falling apart is probably the most urgent task.
Thank you very much. Now it's time to the coffee break. We have only 15 minutes to enjoy the coffee.